In the autumn of 1889, a traveling merchant named Theodore Whitman arrived at the remote Hacienda del Descanso in the mountains of northern New Mexico Territory, carrying with him a leather satchel containing $3,000 in silver coins and a letter of credit from a Denver bank. He was never seen alive again. What began as a simple case of a missing businessman would eventually uncover one of the most calculated and methodical murder sprees in American frontier history, orchestrated by two sisters whose hospitality masked an insatiable appetite for death. The story I'm about to tell you challenges everything we think we know about the bonds of family, the nature of evil, and the darkness that can flourish in isolation. This is the macabre story of Elena and Carmen Villalobos, the innkeepers who turned their remote mountain refuge into a carefully orchestrated killing ground, claiming the lives of at least 47 travelers over the span of nearly 2 decades. Before we begin this descent into one of the frontier's darkest chapters, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our explorations into the shadows of American history. And please let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts around the world. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains of northern New Mexico Territory in the 1870s were a harsh and unforgiving landscape, where survival depended on cunning, determination, and often pure luck. It was in this remote wilderness, along what was then called the Old Santa Fe Trail, that Elena and Carmen Villalobos established their inn in 1871. The location was strategic, positioned at the convergence of 3 mountain passes used by traders, prospectors, and settlers traveling between Colorado and the markets of Santa Fe. Elena, the elder sister at 28, possessed a sharp intelligence and a natural talent for business that had allowed her to accumulate enough capital to purchase the abandoned trading post that would become Hacienda del Descanso. Carmen, 3 years younger, was known for her beauty and charm, qualities that proved invaluable in attracting weary travelers to their establishment. Together, they created what appeared to be a sanctuary in the wilderness, a place where exhausted travelers could find hot meals, clean beds, and respite from the dangers of mountain travel. The sisters had arrived in New Mexico Territory from Sonora, Mexico, in 1869, fleeing what they claimed was political persecution following the execution of Emperor Maximilian. They spoke fluent English and Spanish, carried themselves with the refined bearing of educated women, and possessed enough money to establish themselves as respectable businesswomen in a territory where such independence was rare for women of any background. Local records from the territorial capital in Santa Fe show that Elena Villalobos registered the inn as a legitimate business, paying taxes and fees promptly and maintaining correspondence with suppliers in Denver, Albuquerque, and Santa Fe. To all outward appearances, the Villalobos sisters were exactly what they claimed to be, enterprising women who had found a profitable niche serving travelers along one of the territory's most challenging routes. Dr. Samuel Martinez, who served as the territorial physician for the northern districts, first encountered the Villalobos sisters in the spring of 1872 when he was summoned to treat Elena for what she described as a persistent cough. Dr. Martinez, a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, who had come west seeking adventure and opportunity, was immediately struck by the sisters' sophistication and education. They were unlike any women I had encountered in the territory, Dr. Martinez would later write in his memoirs. Elena possessed a keen intellect and spoke knowledgeably about literature, politics, and current events. Carmen was equally intelligent, though she preferred to express herself through music and art. Their inn was furnished with genuine antiques, fine china, and an extensive library that would not have been out of place in a Philadelphia drawing room. The success of Hacienda del Descanso appeared to be built on the sisters' ability to provide luxury and comfort in an environment where such amenities were virtually unknown. Travelers who stayed at the inn frequently wrote letters to newspapers praising the quality of the accommodations, the excellence of the cuisine, and the gracious hospitality of their hosts. The inn's guest registry, which Elena maintained meticulously, showed a steady stream of visitors, merchants, mining engineers, government officials, and wealthy tourists drawn to the romance of the frontier. But beneath this veneer of respectability, the Villalobos sisters were developing a system of murder so methodical and well concealed that it would continue undetected for nearly 20 years. Their first victim, according to evidence that would later be uncovered, was most likely a prospector named James McAllister, who arrived at the inn in November 1871, just 2 months after the sisters had opened for business. McAllister, a Scottish immigrant who had been working claims in the Colorado Territory, was traveling to Santa Fe to register new mining rights and arrange financing for expanded operations. He carried with him gold dust worth approximately $2,000, a substantial sum that represented years of dangerous work in the mountains. According to the inn's guest registry, McAllister checked in on November 15, 1871, but there is no record of his departure, and he never arrived in Santa Fe to conduct his business. When McAllister's business partners inquired about his whereabouts, Elena Villalobos informed them that he had left the inn on the morning of November 18th, apparently deciding to winter in Denver rather than continue to Santa Fe. She expressed concern for his welfare, noting that he had seemed agitated during his stay and had mentioned difficulties with claim jumpers who might be following him. Her explanation was plausible, and given the dangers of winter travel in the mountains, McAllister's partners assumed he had indeed changed his plans. What they could not have known was that James McAllister had never left Hacienda del Descanso alive. His body, along with those of dozens of other victims, lay buried in carefully concealed graves scattered throughout the property's extensive grounds. The Villalobos sisters had discovered that their remote location, which attracted travelers carrying substantial amounts of cash and valuables, also provided the perfect opportunity for murder and robbery on an industrial scale. The method the sisters employed was as elegant as it was deadly. Rather than resorting to crude violence that might leave obvious evidence or raise suspicions, they had developed a sophisticated system based on poison, patience, and precise timing. Elena, who had studied chemistry and pharmacology during her education in Mexico, had become expert in the preparation of various toxic substances derived from plants common to the region. The primary weapon in their arsenal was a preparation derived from the seeds of the castor bean plant, which grew wild in the lower elevations of their mountain valley. Eleanor had learned to extract ricin from these seeds, creating a virtually undetectable poison that could be administered in small doses over several days. The poison caused symptoms that closely resembled various common ailments: nausea, weakness, fever, and eventual organ failure. To any observer, including trained physicians, the victims appeared to be suffering from natural illness rather than deliberate poisoning. The sisters' routine was carefully choreographed and varied according to the perceived wealth and circumstances of their guests. Travelers who appeared to carry modest amounts of money or who were traveling in groups were treated to genuine hospitality and sent on their way with glowing recommendations for the inn. But guests who traveled alone and displayed signs of significant wealth became targets for what the sisters privately called the treatment. Carmen, whose beauty and charm made her particularly effective at gathering information, would engage selected guests in conversation during their evening meals, skillfully drawing out details about their backgrounds, destinations, and most importantly, the nature and extent of their wealth. Guests often found themselves confiding in the lovely innkeeper, sharing details about successful business ventures, valuable cargo, or hidden caches of gold and silver. Meanwhile, Elena would begin the subtle process of administering poison, typically by preparing special meals or drinks that she claimed were regional delicacies or medicinal tonics designed to help travelers adjust to the high altitude. The doses were carefully calculated to produce symptoms gradually, ensuring that victims would not immediately associate their illness with anything they had consumed at the inn. Father Miguel Santos, a Franciscan priest who had traveled through the region extensively during the 1870s and 1880s, later recalled his growing unease about the number of travelers who seemed to fall ill after staying at Hacienda del Descanso. "I began to notice a pattern," Father Santos would testify during the eventual investigation. "Healthy men would arrive at the inn full of life and energy, but when I encountered them days later in Santa Fe or other towns, they appeared weak and sickly. Some complained of persistent stomach ailments that had begun during their stay with the Villalobos sisters." Father Santos had initially attributed these illnesses to the challenges of mountain travel and the rich food served at the inn, which might disagree with men accustomed to simple trail rations. But as the pattern repeated itself over several years, he began to suspect that something more sinister might be occurring at the remote mountain inn. The priest's suspicions were reinforced by another troubling observation. An unusually high number of travelers who had stayed at Hacienda del Descanso subsequently disappeared entirely, never reaching their intended destinations. When Father Santos made discreet inquiries, he was told by Elena or Carmen that these men had changed their plans, taken alternate routes, or decided to winter at various locations rather than continue their journeys. The sisters always had plausible explanations, Father Santos recalled. A merchant might have decided to try a different market. A prospector might have heard of promising claims in another territory. A government official might have received urgent orders requiring him to travel elsewhere. Each explanation made sense individually, but taken together, they suggested an implausible number of spontaneous changes of plan. The Villalobos sisters had learned to vary their methods according to circumstances, ensuring that no clear pattern would emerge that might attract official attention. Some victims were poisoned slowly over a period of days, allowing them to depart the inn before dying, creating the impression that they had succumbed to illness during their travels. Others were given larger doses that killed them while they were still guests at the inn, after which the sisters would claim they had died of natural causes during the night. For victims who died at the inn, the sisters had developed an efficient system for disposal. They would notify Dr. Martinez or other traveling physicians that a guest had passed away suddenly, requesting certification of death from natural causes. Given the isolation of the inn and the prevalence of various diseases among travelers, such deaths were not uncommon, and physicians rarely questioned the sisters' accounts of a guest's final hours. Elena had studied human anatomy sufficiently to understand how to position bodies and arrange scenes to support claims of death from heart failure, stroke, or other natural causes. She was also skilled at forging documents, creating false letters that appeared to be from the deceased, explaining changes in travel plans or business arrangements that would account for their failure to reach their destinations. The bodies of guests who died at the inn were buried in unmarked graves scattered throughout the property's 200 acres. The sisters had identified numerous locations where graves could be concealed, beneath fallen trees, in natural depressions that could be covered with rocks and brush, and in areas where the rocky soil would make casual discovery unlikely. Each burial site was carefully mapped in a coded ledger that Elena maintained, allowing the sisters to avoid accidentally disturbing previous graves when burying new victims. The wealth accumulated through these murders was substantial. By conservative estimates based on evidence discovered later, the Villalobos sisters stole more than $100,000 in cash, gold, and valuables over the course of their killing spree, an enormous fortune by the standards of the frontier economy. This money allowed them to maintain their sophisticated lifestyle and continue improving the inn, attracting ever wealthier victims to their mountain refuge. The sisters were careful to convert stolen gold and silver gradually, using multiple banks and trading posts to avoid suspicion. They established accounts in Denver, Albuquerque, and Kansas City, rotating their deposits to prevent any single institution from noting unusual activity. Elena also invested in legitimate businesses, purchasing interests in mines, ranches, and trading companies that provided additional cover for their wealth. As their operation expanded, the sisters began to attract the attention of increasingly prominent victims. In 1878, they murdered William Ashford, a railroad surveyor who was carrying detailed maps of proposed rail routes through Colorado and New Mexico. His disappearance was noted by railroad executives, but the sisters successfully convinced investigators that Ashford had been recruited by a competing railroad company and had departed suddenly to work on a secret project. In 1882, they killed Judge Harold Blackwood, a federal judge traveling to Santa Fe to preside over a major territorial court case. Blackwood's murder required particularly careful planning, as his failure to appear in court would certainly trigger an investigation. The sisters solved this problem by forging a letter from Blackwood to the territorial governor, claiming that he had received urgent family news requiring him to return to Virginia immediately. The forged letter bought them sufficient time to dispose of the body and establish the fiction that Blackwood had departed the territory. Perhaps their most audacious crime was the murder of Colonel Marcus Fitzgerald, a Civil War veteran who had become wealthy through military contracts and was traveling to New Mexico to invest in silver mining operations. Fitzgerald carried with him not only a substantial amount of cash, but also detailed information about government mining policies and valuable intelligence about silver deposits throughout the territory. The colonel's murder in 1885 demonstrated the sisters' ability to exploit even the most challenging circumstances. Fitzgerald was traveling with a small escort of former soldiers, making it impossible to kill him at the inn without disposing of multiple witnesses. The sisters solved this problem by poisoning the entire party's dinner with carefully calculated doses designed to take effect after they had departed the inn. All 4 men died during their journey, apparently succumbing to food poisoning from contaminated supplies they had purchased before reaching Hacienda del Descanso. The sisters had anticipated this strategy, ensuring that the men carried provisions that could plausibly be blamed for their deaths. An investigation concluded that the travelers had died from eating spoiled meat, and no connection was made to their stay at the Villalobos inn. By the mid-1880s, the Villalobos sisters had perfected their system to such a degree that they were able to kill with virtual impunity. Their reputation for hospitality continued to grow, and the inn was frequently recommended by territorial officials and business leaders who had enjoyed genuine hospitality during their own visits. The sisters were careful to treat prominent guests who might be missed immediately with genuine care, reserving their lethal attention for travelers whose disappearances could be easily explained or concealed. Carmen had developed particular expertise in identifying ideal victims. She learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated a traveler was carrying substantial wealth. The quality of his clothing and equipment, his manner of speaking, his knowledge of financial markets, and most importantly, his travel plans and social connections. A wealthy merchant traveling alone to conduct private business was far more vulnerable than a government official whose itinerary was known to multiple parties. The sisters also became skilled at manipulating the flow of information about their victims. They maintained correspondence with businesses and individuals throughout the territory, occasionally forwarding forged letters that appeared to be from missing guests, explaining delays or changes in plans. These communications helped maintain the fiction that their victims were alive and traveling elsewhere, buying time for the truth about their deaths to be forgotten. Helena's expertise in chemistry expanded beyond simple poisoning to include the preservation and concealment of evidence. She developed techniques for accelerating the decomposition of bodies, using lime and other chemicals to reduce remains more quickly than natural processes would allow. She also learned to identify and dispose of personal effects that might be traced to specific individuals, while keeping valuable items that could be safely sold or traded. The sisters' success depended not only on their criminal skills, but also on the social and economic conditions of the frontier. The vast distances between settlements, the dangers of travel, and the transient nature of the population all worked in their favor. In an era when communication was slow and unreliable, when travelers regularly changed their plans without notice, and when death from natural causes was common, the sisters' crimes blended seamlessly into the normal hazards of frontier life. Dr. Martinez, who had maintained a professional relationship with the sisters for more than a decade, began to develop suspicions about the unusual number of deaths that seemed to occur among guests at Hacienda del Descanso. As a physician, he was trained to look for patterns in illness and death, and the frequency with which travelers died during or shortly after staying at the inn struck him as statistically improbable. "I began keeping informal records of the deaths I was called to certify at the inn," Dr. Martinez later testified. "Over a period of 5 years, from 1880 to 1885, I certified the deaths of 11 guests at Hacienda del Descanso. In the same period, I certified only 3 deaths at all other inns and boarding houses in my district combined. The disparity was striking, but I initially attributed it to the inn's location in a particularly challenging mountain environment." Dr. Martinez's growing suspicions were reinforced by his observations of the sisters themselves. Despite the emotional toll that repeated guest deaths might be expected to take on compassionate innkeepers, Eleanor and Carmen seemed remarkably resilient. They expressed appropriate sorrow when guests died, but they never appeared to be deeply affected by these tragedies. and they continued to operate their business with undiminished enthusiasm. The physician also noticed subtle inconsistencies in the sisters' accounts of their guests' final hours. Medical details that should have been fresh in their memories sometimes changed between conversations, and their descriptions of symptoms occasionally failed to match the physical evidence he observed during his examinations. These discrepancies were minor and could easily be attributed to the stress of dealing with sudden death, but they contributed to Dr. Martinez's growing unease. The beginning of the end for the Villalobos sisters came in the winter of 1889, with the arrival of Theodore Whitman, the traveling merchant whose disappearance would finally trigger the investigation that brought their reign of terror to an end. Whitman was different from most of their previous victims in several crucial ways that the sisters failed to fully appreciate. First, Whitman was traveling on business for a large Denver banking house that expected regular communication from its representatives. His failure to send scheduled reports would be noticed quickly and investigated thoroughly. Second, he was carrying not only cash, but also negotiable instruments that could be traced if they were cashed or deposited. Finally, and most importantly, Whitman had shared detailed information about his travel plans with multiple parties, including his employer, his family, and business contacts in Santa Fe. Theodore Whitman arrived at Hacienda del Descanso on November 12, 1889, during an early winter storm that forced him to seek shelter earlier than planned. He was traveling from Denver to Santa Fe to arrange financing for a silver mining operation in Colorado, carrying $3,000 in silver coins and a letter of credit worth an additional $5,000. Carmen immediately recognized Whitman as an ideal victim. He was traveling alone, carried substantial wealth, and appeared to be conducting private business that might explain delays or changes in his itinerary. During dinner on his first evening at the inn, she skillfully drew him into conversation about his business, learning details about his mission and the valuable documents he carried. What Carmen failed to understand was that Whitman was an experienced traveling representative who had been specifically trained to be cautious about sharing sensitive information. While he appeared to be confiding in his charming hostess, he was actually providing carefully edited information, designed to protect both himself and his employer's interests. He had not revealed the full extent of his resources or the true nature of his business in Santa Fe. Elena began administering poison to Whitman with his breakfast on November 13th, using her standard technique of introducing ricin through specially prepared coffee that she claimed was a local delicacy. The dose was calculated to produce symptoms gradually over several days, allowing Whitman to depart the inn before becoming seriously ill. But Whitman was a cautious man who had survived years of dangerous travel by paying attention to subtle warning signs. He noticed that the coffee had an unusual bitter aftertaste and observed that Carmen seemed unusually interested in ensuring that he consumed the entire cup. Most importantly, he had heard rumors during his travels about travelers who had fallen ill after staying at remote inns, and he was prepared to trust his instincts when something seemed wrong. Instead of consuming the full dose of poisoned coffee, Whitman secretly disposed of most of the liquid while pretending to drink normally. He also made a point of complimenting Eleanor on the coffee's unique flavor, hoping to encourage her to describe its preparation. Her response confirmed his suspicions. Eleanor's explanation of the coffee's origins was vague and inconsistent, and her insistence that he try additional cups throughout the day struck him as unnaturally persistent. That evening, Whitman made a decision that would ultimately save his life and expose the sisters' crimes. Rather than remaining at the inn for the additional days Elena suggested, citing concerns about weather conditions, he announced his intention to depart early the following morning. He claimed that urgent business matters required him to reach Santa Fe more quickly than originally planned. The sisters found themselves in a difficult position. Their standard method required several days to complete, and Whitman's early departure would prevent them from administering a fatal dose of poison. They could not allow him to leave with his wealth intact, but they also could not risk the suspicion that would arise if he died suddenly during his brief stay. Elena made the fatal decision to accelerate their timeline. Rather than allowing Whitman to depart safely, she decided to administer a larger dose of poison with his dinner, hoping to kill him during the night and then claim he had died of a sudden illness. It was a departure from their usual careful methodology, and it would prove to be the mistake that finally exposed their crimes. Whitman, already suspicious about the coffee, was alert for additional attempts to poison him. When Elena personally served him dinner and encouraged him to try a special sauce that she claimed was made from local herbs, he again pretended to eat while actually disposing of most of the food. However, he did consume enough of the poisoned sauce to absorb a significant amount of ricin. During the night, Whitman became violently ill, experiencing the severe nausea and abdominal pain characteristic of ricin poisoning. But rather than calling for help from his hostesses, he realized that his illness confirmed his suspicions about their intentions. Summoning all his strength, he gathered his belongings and fled the inn before dawn, struggling through the snow toward the nearest settlement. Whitman managed to reach the trading post of San Miguel, 15 miles from Hacienda del Descanso, before collapsing from the effects of the poison. The post's operator, a former army surgeon named Captain James Morrison, recognized the symptoms of poisoning and immediately began treatment to counteract the toxins. Morrison's quick action saved Whitman's life, though the merchant remained seriously ill for several weeks. As Whitman recovered, he provided Captain Morrison with a detailed account of his experiences at the Villalobos Inn. Morrison, who had served in the military during the Indian Wars and had developed a healthy skepticism about claims of accidental death in remote locations, took Whitman's accusations seriously. He dispatched riders to Santa Fe to report the incident to territorial authorities and to summon Dr. Martinez to examine the victim. Dr. Martinez's examination of Whitman confirmed Morrison's diagnosis of ricin poisoning. The physician was immediately struck by the implications of this finding. Ricin was not a substance that occurred naturally in food, and its presence in Whitman's system could only be explained by deliberate administration. Moreover, the symptoms matched those he had observed in several guests who had died at Hacienda del Descanso over the years. I realized immediately that I had been a fool, Dr. Martinez later wrote. The evidence had been in front of me for years, but I had been blinded by the sisters' reputation, and my own reluctance to believe that such refined ladies could be capable of systematic murder. Whitman's case forced me to confront the terrible possibility that I had been unwittingly certifying the deaths of murder victims for more than a decade. Dr. Martinez rode immediately to Santa Fe to meet with Territorial Governor Edmund Ross and provide a full report on Whitman's poisoning and his suspicions about the Villalobos sisters. Governor Ross, a former Union Army officer who had served in the Senate before accepting the territorial appointment, understood the serious implications of the physician's report. If the accusations were true, the sisters had been operating one of the most extensive murder schemes in the history of the American frontier. Governor Ross contacted federal authorities in Denver and requested assistance from U.S. Marshals with experience in complex criminal investigations. He also ordered a comprehensive review of all territorial records related to deaths, disappearances, and missing persons reports that might be connected to Hacienda del Descanso. The investigation that followed would uncover evidence of crimes far more extensive than anyone had imagined. U.S. Marshal William Crawford arrived in Santa Fe in January 1890 to lead the investigation into the Villalobos sisters. Crawford was a veteran law enforcement officer who had tracked down some of the most dangerous criminals on the frontier, and he brought with him a team of deputies and investigators experienced in complex cases involving multiple jurisdictions. Crawford's first step was to interview Theodore Whitman thoroughly, gathering every detail about his stay at the inn and his interactions with the sisters. Whitman's account provided valuable insights into the sisters' methods and confirmed Dr. Martinez's medical findings about the poisoning. Crawford was particularly interested in Whitman's observations about the inn's physical layout, the sisters' behavior patterns, and any evidence of previous victims. The marshal then expanded his investigation to include a systematic review of disappearances and unexplained deaths throughout the territory over the previous 20 years. Working with territorial records and newspaper archives, Crawford's team identified more than 60 cases of travelers who had disappeared after staying at Hacienda del Descanso or who had died under suspicious circumstances shortly after leaving the inn. The pattern that emerged was damning. The vast majority of the missing travelers were wealthy men traveling alone on business. Most carried substantial amounts of cash or valuable merchandise. All had stayed at the Villalobos Inn shortly before their disappearances. And in nearly every case, the sisters had provided explanations for the travelers' failures to reach their destinations, claiming that the men had changed their plans or decided to pursue opportunities elsewhere. Crawford also interviewed dozens of witnesses, including other innkeepers, traders, territorial officials, and anyone who had regular contact with travelers along the Santa Fe Trail. The Marshals team discovered that rumors about the unusual number of deaths and disappearances associated with Hacienda del Descanso had been circulating for years, but no one had taken action to investigate these concerns systematically. Father Miguel Santos provided particularly valuable testimony about his observations over nearly 2 decades of travel through the region. The priest's detailed records of his encounters with travelers who had stayed at the inn revealed a clear pattern of illness and subsequent disappearance that could not be explained by chance or natural causes. "I had failed in my duty as a shepherd," Father Santos testified. "I had observed the pattern for years, but I had not acted on my suspicions. I had allowed my reluctance to believe evil of 2 women who appeared so pious and refined to override my responsibility to protect the innocent. The blood of their victims is partially on my hands." As evidence mounted against the sisters, Crawford prepared to arrest them at their remote mountain inn. However, he faced significant challenges in approaching Hacienda del Descanso without alerting the suspects to the investigation. The inn's location provided excellent visibility of approaching travelers, and the sisters had demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secret. Crawford decided to approach the inn using a deception designed to prevent the sisters from suspecting that they were under investigation. He and 2 deputies posed as prospective investors interested in purchasing property in the region for development. They arrived at Hacienda del Descanso on February 14, 1890, presenting themselves as wealthy businessmen exploring opportunities in the expanding territory. Elena and Carmen welcomed their guests warmly, apparently seeing them as potential victims rather than investigators. The inn appeared prosperous and well-maintained, with no obvious signs of criminal activity. The sisters' behavior was gracious and professional, and they seemed genuinely pleased to host such distinguished guests. Crawford and his deputies spent 2 days at the inn, carefully observing the sisters' routines and searching for evidence without arousing suspicion. They noted the locations of outbuildings, storage areas, and any features of the property that might be relevant to disposing of bodies. They also paid careful attention to the sisters' interactions, looking for signs of the partnership that had enabled their crimes. On the morning of February 16th, Crawford revealed his true identity and placed both sisters under arrest for the murder of Theodore Whitman and conspiracy to commit murder. The sisters' reactions were markedly different. Elena maintained her composure, calmly asking to see the warrants and requesting permission to gather personal belongings. Carmen became hysterical, screaming that they were innocent and demanding to know what evidence supported the charges. The search of Hacienda del Descanso began immediately after the arrests. Crawford's team, now expanded to include additional deputies and territorial officials, conducted a methodical examination of the inn and its grounds. What they discovered exceeded their worst expectations and provided chilling confirmation of the scope of the sisters' crimes. In Elena's private quarters, investigators found detailed records of the inn's guests dating back to 1871. The ledgers included not only the standard information found in guest registries, but also Elena's personal assessments of each visitor's wealth, travel plans, and vulnerability. Guests who had become victims were marked with special symbols, and their entries included notes about the methods used to kill them and the locations where their bodies were buried. The investigators also discovered Elena's chemistry laboratory, hidden in a basement room beneath the inn's kitchen. The laboratory contained sophisticated equipment for distilling and refining various substances, along with detailed notes on the preparation of ricin and other toxins. Elena had clearly devoted considerable time and effort to perfecting her poisoning techniques, experimenting with different doses and delivery methods to achieve maximum effectiveness while minimizing suspicion. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of Elena's collection of personal effects taken from victims. She had kept jewelry, watches, distinctive clothing items, and other mementos from each murder, storing them in carefully labeled boxes that corresponded to entries in her victim ledgers. The collection represented a gruesome trophy room documenting nearly 20 years of systematic killing. Carmen's quarters revealed a different aspect of the sisters' partnership. While Elena had focused on the technical aspects of murder and disposal, Carmen had maintained detailed psychological profiles of their victims. Her journals contained extensive observations about human nature, documenting techniques for gaining travelers' trust, extracting information about their resources, and identifying their weaknesses and fears. The search of the inn's grounds confirmed the investigators' worst fears about the number of victims. Using Elena's coded maps, Crawford's team located burial sites scattered throughout the property. The initial excavation revealed the remains of 12 individuals buried in various locations around the inn. Subsequent searches expanded to cover the entire property and nearby areas where additional graves might be concealed. Over a period of 6 weeks, investigators ultimately recovered the remains of 47 victims buried on or near the Villalobos property. The bodies were found in various states of preservation, depending on the burial conditions and the length of time since death. Many of the remains showed evidence of the chemical treatments Elena had used to accelerate decomposition and reduce the likelihood of discovery. Identification of the victims proved challenging, as many had been buried for years and carried limited identifying materials. However, investigators were able to match personal effects found in Elena's collection with missing persons reports and family descriptions. Dental records, when available, provided additional confirmation of identities. The victims represented a cross-section of frontier society, united only by their wealth and their misfortune in choosing Hacienda del Descanso for accommodation. They included merchants, mining engineers, land speculators, government officials, railroad surveyors, and wealthy tourists. Ages ranged from the early 20s to the 60s, and the victims came from across the United States and several foreign countries. Among the identified victims were several men whose disappearances had attracted significant attention from law enforcement and business communities. The discovery of their remains at the inn finally solved mysteries that had puzzled investigators for years and provided closure to families who had never learned the fate of their missing relatives. The evidence against the Villalobos sisters was overwhelming. Elena's detailed records provided a complete confession to dozens of murders, including specific information about methods, motives, and burial locations. The chemical laboratory demonstrated her expertise in preparing poisons, while the collection of victims' personal effects proved her direct involvement in their deaths. Carmen's psychological profiles and her role in identifying and manipulating victims established her as an equal partner in the crimes, rather than a reluctant accomplice. Her detailed observations about human behavior and her techniques for gaining travelers' trust showed a calculated and methodical approach to murder that matched Elena's technical expertise. The trial of Elena and Carmen Villalobos began in Santa Fe in September 1890, attracting national attention as details of their crimes became public. The prosecution, led by Territorial Attorney General John Miller, presented overwhelming evidence of the sisters' guilt, including their own written records, the testimony of Theodore Whitman, and the physical evidence recovered from their property. The defense, recognizing the hopelessness of claiming innocence in the face of such evidence, attempted to argue that the sisters had acted under extreme duress or mental incapacity. Defense attorneys suggested that Elena had dominated and manipulated her younger sister, forcing Carmen to participate in crimes she would never have committed independently. However, Carmen's detailed psychological profiles of victims and her enthusiastic participation in identifying and manipulating targets undermined claims that she was merely a reluctant follower. The evidence clearly showed that both sisters had participated actively and willingly in planning and executing their crimes over nearly 2 decades. Elena Villalobos showed no remorse during the trial, maintaining her composure and occasionally appearing to take pride in the sophistication of her methods. When asked by the judge if she wished to make a statement before sentencing, she delivered a chilling address that revealed the depth of her sociopathic personality. "Your Honor, I am not sorry for what I have done," Elena declared. "These men came to our inn carrying wealth they had often obtained through exploitation of others. They sought to profit from the labor of miners, the displacement of native peoples, and the resources of this territory. We simply redistributed their wealth to more deserving recipients. We provided them with comfort and luxury in their final days, which is more consideration than they showed to those they exploited. Carmen's reaction was markedly different. She wept throughout much of the trial and appeared to be genuinely shocked by the full extent of their crimes as evidence was presented. In her final statement, she claimed that she had been manipulated by her older sister and had not fully understood the consequences of their actions until it was too late to withdraw from the partnership. "I loved my sister and trusted her judgment completely," Carmen testified. "When she told me we were helping travelers who were corrupt and evil, I believed her. When she said we were performing a service by redistributing wealth from the wicked to the deserving, I accepted her explanation. I realize now that I allowed my love for Elena to blind me to the horror of what we were doing." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both sisters. Judge William Stone sentenced both women to death by hanging, rejecting defense arguments for clemency based on their gender or Carmen's claims of manipulation. The judge noted that the systematic nature of their crimes and the large number of victims demanded the ultimate penalty regardless of the defendant's sex. These defendants have shown a callous disregard for human life that surpasses any criminal case I have encountered in 30 years on the bench, Judge Stone declared. They murdered dozens of innocent men for financial gain, showing no mercy or remorse for their actions. The law demands justice for their victims, and justice requires that they forfeit their own lives for the lives they have taken. Elena and Carmen Villalobos were executed by hanging on March 15, 1891, in the courtyard of the territorial prison in Santa Fe. Elena maintained her defiant attitude to the end, refusing to express remorse or provide information about potential additional victims. Carmen spent her final hours in prayer with Father Santos, who had traveled from his parish to provide spiritual comfort during her last days. The execution drew hundreds of spectators, including family members of identified victims who had traveled great distances to witness justice being served. Theodore Whitman, the merchant whose survival had exposed the sisters' crimes, stood among the witnesses as the sentences were carried out. He later wrote that watching the executions provided some measure of closure, though he continued to suffer from nightmares about his experience at Hacienda del Descanso for the remainder of his life. In the aftermath of the sisters' execution, investigators continued searching for additional burial sites and trying to identify the remaining victims. Several families who had lost relatives in the region came forward with information that helped resolve some of the unidentified cases. However, 5 victims were never identified, their remains buried in unmarked graves in the Santa Fe cemetery, with simple markers reading "Unknown victim of the Villalobos sisters." The case of Elena and Carmen Villalobos had profound impacts on law enforcement practices and public awareness throughout the American frontier. Territorial authorities implemented new requirements for reporting deaths and disappearances, particularly those involving travelers staying at remote inns and trading posts. The case also led to increased cooperation between territorial and federal law enforcement agencies in investigating crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Dr. Samuel Martinez, whose delayed recognition of the sisters' crimes had haunted him since the investigation began, devoted the remainder of his career to developing better methods for detecting poison-related deaths. He published several medical papers on the identification of plant-based toxins and became a leading expert on forensic medicine in the Western Territories. The physician also worked with territorial authorities to establish protocols for investigating suspicious deaths in remote locations. His recommendations included mandatory autopsies for travelers who died away from their homes, standardized reporting procedures for physicians certifying deaths, and regular communication between medical professionals about unusual patterns of illness or mortality. Marshal William Crawford continued his law enforcement career, eventually becoming a U.S. Marshal for the entire New Mexico Territory. He often cited the Villalobos case as an example of the importance of taking seriously reports of suspicious patterns, even when they involved respected members of the community. Crawford's investigation methods became a model for complex criminal cases involving multiple jurisdictions and victims. The Marshal also worked to improve communication between law enforcement agencies across the frontier, recognizing that the isolation and poor communication that had enabled the sisters' crimes continued to pose challenges for detecting and prosecuting criminals who operated across territorial boundaries. His efforts contributed to the development of more sophisticated law enforcement networks that would become essential as the frontier became more settled and civilized. Father Miguel Santos carried the weight of his failure to act on his suspicions for the rest of his life. He left his parish in northern New Mexico and spent his remaining years working with families of crime victims, providing spiritual counsel and practical assistance to those dealing with the aftermath of violent crime. The priest often spoke about the importance of trusting one's instincts when observing suspicious patterns, even when those suspicions involved respected members of the community. In his later writings, Father Santos reflected on the theological questions raised by the Villalobos case. He struggled to understand how two women who appeared devout and refined could commit such systematic evil, and he questioned his own ability to recognize evil when it was masked by apparent respectability and charm. The site of Hacienda del Descanso was abandoned after the sister's execution, as no one was willing to purchase property associated with such horrific crimes. The buildings gradually fell into ruin, and the land reverted to the territory. For decades, travelers avoided the area, and local folklore developed numerous ghost stories about the spirits of the sisters' victims haunting the remote mountain valley. In 1925, a wealthy philanthropist purchased the former Villalobos property and converted it into a memorial garden dedicated to the victims of frontier violence. Each of the 47 identified victims is remembered with a stone marker bearing their name, age, and place of origin. The 5 unidentified victims are honored with a collective monument acknowledging their suffering and the tragedy of their forgotten identities. The memorial also includes a small museum documenting the history of the case and its impact on law enforcement and public safety practices. Educational displays explain the methods the sisters used to kill their victims and the investigative techniques that ultimately brought them to justice. The museum serves as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and community responsibility in protecting vulnerable individuals from predators. Theodore Whitman, the merchant whose survival exposed the sisters' crimes, became a successful businessman in Denver and devoted considerable time and resources to supporting the families of crime victims. He established a fund to assist with the costs of identifying and burying victims of unsolved crimes, recognizing that many families lacked the resources to pursue justice for their missing relatives. Whitman also worked with law enforcement agencies to improve protection for traveling businessmen, advocating for better communication systems and standardized safety protocols at remote accommodations. His efforts contributed to the development of commercial traveler associations that provided mutual support and protection for their members. Despite his success and his role in bringing the sisters to justice, Whitman never fully recovered from his experience at Hacienda del Descanso. He suffered from chronic health problems related to the ricin poisoning and experienced persistent anxiety about traveling alone or staying at unfamiliar accommodations. His wife later wrote that he never again ate food prepared by strangers without careful consideration of its safety. The Villalobos case also had significant impacts on the role of women in frontier society. The crimes committed by Elena and Carmen challenged prevailing assumptions about female nature and capabilities, forcing communities to acknowledge that women could be just as capable of systematic violence as men. This recognition led to changes in law enforcement practices, including increased scrutiny of crimes involving female suspects and greater awareness of women's potential roles in criminal enterprises. Legal scholars of the era debated the implications of the case for understanding criminal behavior and moral responsibility. The sisters' education, refinement, and apparent religiosity contradicted popular theories about the origins of criminal behavior, which typically attributed such conduct to poverty, ignorance, or moral corruption arising from disadvantaged circumstances. The fact that educated, sophisticated women could commit such systematic and calculated murders forced criminologists to develop more nuanced theories about the nature of evil and the factors that could lead individuals to commit horrific crimes. The case contributed to early discussions about psychopathy and sociopathy, though the scientific understanding of these conditions would not be fully developed for several more decades. Elena's detailed records and Carmen's psychological profiles provided valuable insights into the minds of systematic killers that influenced the development of criminal psychology as a scientific discipline. Researchers studied the sisters' writings and methods to better understand how individuals could rationalize mass murder and maintain normal social facades while committing repeated acts of extreme violence. The case also raised important questions about the responsibility of communities to protect vulnerable individuals from predators operating in their midst. The fact that rumors and suspicions about the sisters had circulated for years without triggering serious investigation highlighted the dangers of assuming that respected community members could not be capable of serious crimes. Father Santos, Dr. Martinez and other community leaders who had failed to act on their suspicions became examples of how social dynamics and personal biases could interfere with public safety. Their experiences were studied by law enforcement professionals and social reformers seeking to develop better systems for reporting and investigating suspicious activities. The long-term impacts of the Villalobos case extended far beyond New Mexico territory. Newspapers across the United States covered the trial extensively, and the details of the sisters' crimes captured the public imagination in ways that influenced popular culture and public perceptions of crime and justice on the frontier. The case contributed to a growing awareness that the American frontier, despite its promises of opportunity and freedom, also harbored significant dangers for unwary travelers. This recognition led to increased demands for better law enforcement, improved communication systems, and more effective protection for individuals traveling through remote areas. The methods used by Elena and Carmen Villalobos also influenced criminal behavior in other parts of the country. Law enforcement agencies reported several copycat cases in which criminals attempted to use poison to kill victims while maintaining facades of respectability. The publicity surrounding the sisters' techniques unfortunately provided a blueprint for other potential killers, leading to increased vigilance by medical professionals and law enforcement agencies. However, the same publicity also made it more difficult for such crimes to go undetected. The Villalobos case educated physicians, law enforcement officers, and the general public about the signs of systematic poisoning and the importance of investigating suspicious patterns of illness and death. This increased awareness helped prevent other potential mass murder schemes from reaching the scale achieved by the sisters. As the American frontier gave way to more settled and civilized communities, the Villalobos case became a historical curiosity rather than an immediate public safety concern. However, the lessons learned from the investigation and prosecution continued to influence law enforcement practices and public safety policies throughout the United States. The case demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation, systematic record-keeping, and thorough investigation of suspicious patterns. These lessons became increasingly relevant as criminal activity became more sophisticated and mobile, requiring law enforcement agencies to adapt their methods and coordinate their efforts across broader geographic areas. Modern criminologists and forensic psychologists continue to study the Villalobos case as an example of organized serial killing that predated the development of formal profiling techniques. Elena's detailed records and Carmen's psychological observations provide rare insights into the thought processes and methods of systematic killers operating in an era before modern investigative techniques. The sisters' ability to maintain their respectable facade while committing dozens of murders also serves as a reminder of the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when investigating criminal activity. Their case illustrates how intelligent and charismatic individuals can exploit social expectations and community trust to facilitate their crimes. In recent years, descendants of the sisters' victims have worked with historians and genealogists to learn more about the lives and families of those who died at Hacienda del Descanso. These efforts have helped humanize the victims beyond their roles in the criminal case, honoring their memories as individuals who had hopes, dreams, and loved ones who mourned their losses. The Villalobos case also serves as an early example of crimes motivated primarily by financial gain, rather than passion, revenge, or other emotional factors. The sisters' systematic approach to identifying, targeting, and killing wealthy travelers demonstrated a level of criminal organization and planning that was unusual for the era and provided insights into the development of organized crime in America. Eleanor's expertise in chemistry and Carmen's skills in psychological manipulation represented a sophisticated criminal partnership that combined technical knowledge with social intelligence. Their collaboration showed how individuals with complementary skills could work together to commit crimes far more extensive and successful than either could have achieved alone. The case remains relevant today as an example of how isolated communities and vulnerable populations can be exploited by skilled predators. The social and geographic isolation that enabled the sisters' crimes continues to pose challenges for law enforcement and public safety, particularly in rural and remote areas where criminal activity may go undetected for extended periods. The memorial garden at the former site of Hacienda del Descanso continues to attract visitors interested in the history of frontier crime and the development of American law enforcement. The site serves as both a place of remembrance for the victims and an educational resource for understanding the social and legal changes that resulted from the case. Each year on March 15th, the anniversary of the sisters' execution, a memorial service is held to honor the victims and reflect on the lessons learned from their tragic deaths. These services bring together historians, law enforcement professionals, victim advocates, and community members committed to ensuring that such crimes are never again allowed to continue undetected for such extended periods. The story of Elena and Carmen Villalobos ultimately serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumptions and the importance of vigilance in protecting vulnerable members of society. Their crimes were enabled not only by their own cunning and ruthlessness, but also by a community's failure to take seriously the warning signs that had been present for years. As we reflect on this dark chapter in American frontier history, we must remember that the responsibility for preventing such crimes extends beyond law enforcement to include every member of the community. The merchants, physicians, clergy, and ordinary citizens who encountered the sisters over nearly 2 decades all had opportunities to act on their suspicions and potentially save lives. The 47 men who died at Hacienda del Descanso were not just statistics in a criminal case, but individuals with their own stories, families, and contributions to make to their communities. Their deaths remind us of the human cost of failing to act when patterns of suspicious activity become apparent, even when those patterns involve respected and seemingly trustworthy members of the community. In telling their story, we honor not only the memory of the victims, but also the courage of those like Theodore Whitman, who survived to expose the truth, and the dedication of investigators like Marshall Crawford and Dr. Martinez, who worked tirelessly to bring justice to the victims and their families. Their efforts ensured that Elena and Carmen Villalobos would be remembered not as successful criminals who escaped justice, but as cautionary examples of the evil that can flourish when communities fail to protect their most vulnerable members. The macabre story of the Villalobos sisters stands as a reminder that the darkest crimes often hide behind the most respectable facades, and that our willingness to question, investigate, and act on our suspicions can mean the difference between justice and tragedy for those